Well, for more on this topic, we're joined by Dan Ikenson, Director of Cato's Herbert, a Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Dan, what's your take on the surge that we saw in exports and the factors behind it?
You know, I think global demand is on the rise. We're in a sustained period of growth. Most regions of the globe are doing pretty well, and when that happens, there's increased demand from producers around the world for components that come from China and for end user consumption. So a lot of products are assembled in China. It's the final point of assembly, and it becomes the source of consumer products around the globe. I would say, though, you know, looking at a couple of months worth of data and comparing a couple of months to the same period last year isn't all that robust. And, you know, we're talking about small numbers. We have to see what happens over the course of the year. So it's good. It's good to see this happening, but I would wait to see the March, the April, the May numbers before really reaching any conclusions.
So too soon to say how sustainable this is?
Yes.
All right, so let's look at imports now. How do you think domestic demand, which we know is important to the Chinese economy going forward, how do you see that progressing in the coming months?
Well, I think that demand needs to increase considerably. In the United States, for example, we have a very strong correlation between economic growth and import growth. They rise and fall together. In China, it's much more muted. And, you know, one of the sources of tension, I think, between the United States and China has been this interest among U.S. policymakers in seeing Chinese consumption increase rather than trying to keep its export sector at the head of the economy to lead export-led growth. So I think that, you know, as the middle class continues to have more buying power and actually finds the time to spend its money, we'll see more imports.
Now let's look at some exports that have been in the headlines. Obviously, China's aluminium exports grew more than 25% in the first 2 months of this year. But then we also saw that steel exports fell by a third. Why do you think we're seeing that?
You know, it could have something to do with just a few big orders in some places. So, you know, as the global economy is expanding, there's greater demand for raw materials like aluminum and like steel. The problem for Chinese steel exports is that there are a lot of trade restrictions around the world responding to excess capacity in China, allegations of dumping and subsidization. So it's harder for Chinese steel exporters to get a foothold in a lot of markets now. There are many orders. In the United States, there are 153 anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, and many of them apply to China.
And obviously, we know that U.S. President Donald Trump has made his tariff announcement when it comes to steel and aluminium. How do you see that affecting China's approach to its exports and its industries as well?
Well, you know, to be honest with you, China is not one of the largest sources of U.S. imports of steel or aluminum. And it sounds like Canada and Mexico have already been excluded from this tariff announcement. And so it seems that if I were in China's shoes, I would not overreact to Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, because most of China's exports are already ensnared by these anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures in place. So it's at the margin, it will have a small effect on Chinese exports. Nothing to really ratchet up the pressure over, I think. There are plenty of other fronts for trade frictions to escalate and devolve into a trade war. Hopefully we can avoid that, but steel and aluminum are getting a lot of attention right now, but they really shouldn't be so much sources of friction.
And in terms of what this does for China's overall trade picture, how do you see its picture going forward, not just in 2018, but in the longer term, especially given some of the policies that we've seen out of the two sessions?
Well, look, China's evolving still from a subsistence economy to a manufacturing economy. Now it's trying to make the leap from a manufacturing economy to a high-tech one. I think there's been some struggles along the way to get there, but China is still exceptionally important to global supply chains. It's going to play a major role. Asia is the fastest growing region of the world, and China is the most populous country in the world, a huge engine, and I think that where trade will increase, we will see China playing a central role in that.
All right, thank you as always. Dan Ikenson there from Cato's Herbert, a Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies.